All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of My Endurance Life. If you're new to the group, I'm Eric Schroeder. I'm a USCO certified ultra running coach. I love running, talking about running, and helping other runners become better runners. Every week, I go live into the group and share on a topic of interest. But another way I love helping everyone become better runners is by inviting other coaches and athletes into the group to share on different topics or their own perspective. So tonight we have a special guest, Jeff Browning, and it's a privilege for us to have him here. So welcome him with open arms, and Jeff's going to bring today. If you ever watched a podcast with Jeff, he brings it. So he's gonna have a ton of information. Tonight he's going to be talking on longevity and be touching on a couple of super interesting but important points. The 80-20 rule, strength, mobility, nutrition, injury prevention and imbalances, and how to use periodized cross-training for your peak training to avoid injury and dealing with injury. So if you don't know about Jeff, he's been competing in ultra marathons for over 20 years and has racked up 40 career ultra wins, 30 of those in the 100-mile distance or longer. Jeff has been ranked 7 times in the top 10 of Ultra Running Magazine's North American Ultra Runner of the Year, and he's the only man above 50 to ever make that list, specializing in hard mountain ultras. Currently, Jeff is training for the Cocodona 250, and he just got a second place overall finish this weekend running in the Mesquite 50 miler, which he finished in just under 8 hours. I think he did it in 7 hours and 50 minutes. So for those of you who are trying to do the math, that's like a 9:30-ish per minute mile, and the course had over 7,500 feet of gain. So for those of us entering into middle age or those who have been there for a while, Jeff is an inspiration and example that age is just a number. So Jeff, where can people find you if they're interested in following you or working with you?
You can find me on Instagram at Go Bronco Billy, also Twitter Go Bronco Billy, and Facebook Go Bronco Billy. I have my coaching site is giddyupultra.com.
Awesome. So you guys check that out. And then also if you guys are watching on the replay in YouTube, all the links are in the description. So check them out. If you guys remember last week, we had Mike McKnight on, and Mike's call was like super informative and shared a ton of great information, but he kept referring to this guy, Jeff. So for those of you who are wondering who Jeff is, this is the Jeff he was referring to during the call. So Jeff and Mike have known each other for a long time. Jeff actually coaches Mike, or coached Mike. How long did you coach Mike for?
I've been coaching. I still coach him. Oh man, I think I've been coaching him since 2019. I think
Okay.
somewhere around there, 18 or 19, somewhere around there. I kind of gave him the lowdown when I made the high fat, low carb shift. And then he decided shortly after to do it too. And then he was just kind of trying to do it on his own. And then he finally reached out and we started working together after that.
Great. So before Mike and I jumped on the call last week, I was asking Mike, like, hey, I got Jeff coming on next week. Like, what would you want to know about him, or what would you have him share about? And so this is Mike's idea. He said, if I was interviewing Jeff, I'd want him to talk about longevity. So I don't know if Mike thinks he's getting old, but um, so with that being said, take it away, Jeff.
So longevity, there's a lot of factors with longevity. And I think the number one thing that you need to kind of like have in your head is just being consistent. So I think, creating some kind of habit of consistent training. And that's finding that balance for whatever works for you. Because over the years now that this is my 24th season in the sport of ultra running. I did about a decade of mountain biking before that in my 20s, and I got into ultras when I was 29. And I think one is just creating a habit of working out and making that kind of a lifestyle habit. I think you need to start there so that becomes, for me personally, I feel weird if I don't work out. It's been doing it for so long that I feel a little off. So I think one is the lifestyle habit. I mean, that's where it starts. You have to have the passion for whatever sport it is you pick. And whether that's road running or trail running or shorter races or ultras, it doesn't really matter. It's just creating a lifestyle habit of consistency. Now, as far as the things that will support that consistency, I think let's kind of talk about a foundation of what we can do. And I think part of my longevity in the sport has, I played 4 sports a year growing up in high school, in elementary school and high school. I started lifting weights 4 days a week, doing strength training when I was in 8th grade, all the way through high school, playing 4 sports a year, more traditional sports like basketball, football, track and field, baseball. And then I really got into mountain biking in college in the early 90s. And I started and I continued to strength train during that time. And that's when I really kind of fell in love with just endurance training, and found that I was pretty good at it, meaning I enjoyed it. I liked pushing myself, being out for, on mountain bike rides, hour to 2 hours. And I always was running that whole time too. I was always running, 3 days a week. I had a dog during college that I didn't want to chew up stuff in our junky college house, that I was sharing with 3 other guys. And so I got my dog out, walking and jogging that dog. And so I always had this kind of habit of just doing, trying to stay fit, being in the weight room a little bit, being in the, jogging a little bit, riding my bike. But I mainly consider myself a mountain biker. And then in 2000, I really started kind of pursuing running. And and so, one of the things that I think has served me well was that base in strength training, because I had a pretty good foundation, but I did have imbalances coming in from cycling, because cycling builds a stronger. If anybody's coming from like a cycling background and getting into running, one of the things you'll find is that you're really strong in your upper quads, you're really strong in your hamstrings, especially if you are clipped in and using SPD pedals. You really overdevelop the hamstring compared to the quad, because the lower quad doesn't get as much work, what we call the VMO, or that kind of teardrop shaped muscle on a bodybuilder that's on the inside of your leg, of your quad above the knee. That thing's supposed to be really, really strong, and it pulls your kneecap and makes it track correctly. So I was having a lot of knee problems and what we call patella tendonitis, or runner's knee, in the first 3 years in the sport. And I finally worked with a strength training coach in the off season in 04 and 05, that 2004, 2005, about my third, fourth season in the sport. And I really started working on that quad to hamstring muscle imbalance with weights, and really, really working on that VMO strength. And that kind of fixed the knee issues. And they've never really come back in any big way since then. So like, there are just knowing, one is knowing the body and knowing what muscles are important in running, right? Like what is responsible for good knee tracking, and knowing that you need strong hips. You can't, because every time we land on one leg, right, when we run, we have to stabilize. And so if we have if we can't stand on one leg and we're wobbly, right, then you have either, you're lacking strength in the ankle or the hip. And so we want to really work on hip strength, glute engagement. So one-legged type functional movements. So we're really trying to work on hip strength and hip mobility at the same time. So stuff like pigeon pose in yoga, or figure 4 stretch, where you cross your leg across your other leg. You can do that while you're sitting around, right? You can cross your leg and then lean your chest towards your shin to stretch your hip. So keeping those hips mobile, because that will give you, one of the things that happens is a lot of times with like newer runners, they have either runner's knee, like we're talking about, which can be, you can also do wall sits to help with that VMO strength, so isolating that VMO when you're sitting with a straight back against a wall, feet, legs at a 90-degree angle and straight back, like you're sitting in a straight back chair, making sure that your big toes are pointed straight ahead, making sure your knees are tracking over your second toe. So you don't want your feet out like this or in like this. We want to think about neutral alignment. So, some people are going to come to this with already some imbalances of feet flare out or feet flare in, right? So we want to really work on, I came from a background of kind of being a little pigeon-toed growing up. So I had to, strength training, I really worked in my latter part of strength training. So my late 20s into my 30s and 40s, I really worked on fixing that in my stance. So whenever I was setting up to do a squat or a lunge or wall sits, I was always lining up and thinking about my big toes. You know, this is what I use with athletes that I'm coaching. Think of your big toes as headlights. Your big toes are emitting a light straight out the front of them, and you don't want those lights. You want those lights to be parallel. You don't want them crisscrossing. You don't want them pointing out, away from each other. So always lining up when you're doing strength movements and mobility movements. So we've kind of talked about, hip and kind of knee strength with the VMO. The other one would be ankle mobility. So, and I would say ankle flexion. Sorry if you hear a little dog barking in the background, but my dog's freaking out. Someone probably came to the door. And so anyway, so ankle flexion would be, can your knee be in front of your toe, right? So, and a lot of runners especially have really stiff ankles when it comes to ankle flexion. And that's really important, especially in trail running and ultra running, because because that's part of your suspension. And if you don't have good ankle flexion, we always do a test with our athletes that we make them put their foot a hand's width from a wall and then keep their heel on the ground and push their knee towards the wall. Can their knee touch the wall a hand width away? If they can't, they need to work on their ankle flexion. And so one of the ways we can do that is what we call the ATG split squat. If anybody's familiar with knees over toes guy on YouTube, Ben Patrick, he's kind of made that move famous for knee mobility and knee strength. We definitely coach that movement pattern in our coaching business when we're trying to get, especially if people are complaining about strength. If they're complaining about sore knees, we work on ATG split squat. We work on we also work on wall sits and things like that, and one-legged balance work. The other thing to kind of think about is like trunk mobility too. So if we have a lot of people that come from maybe a triathlon background or a cycling background that get into running. And one of the things and this is one of the things I had problems with coming from a cycling background, when you are cycling, your upper body is stationary and you're just spinning your legs, right? And your hips should be neutral, right, and level, and they are not rotating. But when we run, we drive our elbows back. And when we drive our elbows back, we should slightly rotate at the trunk. And that's one of the things that you'll see, like cyclists be really stiff in the midsection. So through their waist, through their core. And so we really work on trunk mobility. So stuff like cat-cow, stuff like pigeon pose to cobra in yoga. And then also things like where you'd be in a mountain climber lunge. So like in push-up ready position, and you would step forward with your foot as close to your hand as you can get it, and then twist and reach for the sky while you're in a deep lunge. So movements like that. So you're working, but always start. One of our coaches is a PT, and that's part of Giddy Up Ultra Coaching. And one of the things she highly recommends is starting with your spine mobility, meaning like cat-cow, downward dogs, cobra. So before you work on twisting. So you open up the spine first, and then you work on trunk rotation afterwards. So always do it in that kind of succession. That kind of covers kind of general mobility, talking about mobility. I like to kind of talk about strength and mobility together. So, every time I go to the gym, I go to a weight room 3 days a week. And I always do about a 15-minute mobility routine before I move on to my strength routine, because I want to open everything up. I want good movement patterns. I don't want anything tight before I go to move weight. And then strength involves weight. Now, some strength can be used by resistance. Let's say push-ups or pull-ups, right? and I love those two moves because they work so many muscle groups for runners, because we don't really need to overbuild our upper body, but we do need a strong core, especially oblique type of core work, right? So like dead bugs, oblique presses, bridges, or heel raise, single heel raise bridge. So movements like that. So you're working your low back and glutes, and you're also working obliques. Obliques are 2/3 of your core. So if you're just doing crunches, quit doing just crunches. Crunches aren't really helping you as a runner. They might make you look good at the beach, but they aren't going to help you with running, because we want to rotate the spine, just a little bit of trunk rotation. And so working on those kind of things, planks, side planks are really good as well for core. As far as what else can I talk about here? Strength.
Well, I think it's super important that you mentioned how you focused on mobility first before you went to strength, because that way it like leads into like proper posture. Because improper posture can just lead to a world of hurt.
Well, and also if you're tight in a certain spot, what happens when you go to move weight, you're going to engage things when you go to move that weight. And the problem is if you're a little tight in one spot, then that part's turned off, and you're going to move that you're going to try to bring other muscles into the thing that have to compensate for that lack of mobility. So mobility, we have to start with mobility as a foundation and then add strength on top of it. And I would say from a longevity perspective, one of the things we lose as we age is our range of motion. So that's why I love full range of motion movements. I like mobility routines that are like we put it on our athletes' routine on every day, a 10-minute routine of mobility. They can do it in the morning when they first get up, or they can do it before they go to bed. They can do it at the office, on their lunch break, whatever. And it's just really simple, like 8 or 9 moves, but it helps them work through this progression of mobility stuff that is very specific to running. And then they can move on to, if they need to go strength train or they need to go run, but they're kind of checking that box every day. And because one of the things that happens, if you think about it this way, if we're thinking about like really deep forward lunge, right? Like we're talking knees over toes, right? Or we're talking that kind of like mountain climber twist, right? Those kind of movements, think about it from a trail running perspective. Any trail runners on this call will understand, or listening will get this. There's tons of times when you're running down the trail and you're running a 10 or 12-minute mile and you catch a toe on a rock or a root, and you all of a sudden go from running 10 or 12-minute pace to running 5-minute pace, trying not to face plant, right? And kiss dirt. And the runner who is working on their mobility 9 out of 10 times will have good range of motion, where they might just have to put down a hand and like pull out of it with a deep lunge stride and arms flailing, right? Maybe a windmill and put a hand down and maybe skin a hand a little bit, but like you're not going to fall, right? Now there's sometimes you're going to kick something really hard and you're going to slam, and there's something you can do about it. That's part of trail running sometimes, right? We've all done it. I've done it too, but one of the things I think that the person who isn't working on mobility is going to kiss dirt 9 out of 10 times instead of pulling out of it 9 out of 10 times. So that's one of my arguments for like, hey, if you use it, you won't lose it. So let's work on our mobility. So when we do trip, because what happens when we age, what's our biggest setbacks? It's like breaking a hip or breaking a leg or breaking a collarbone or something like that. And we're way slower to heal as we age. And so, and then we lose all our fitness and everything else. And it's all from lack of range of motion. So we trip and we fall and we can't catch ourselves and we break our hip, right? So that we want to keep mobility as kind of that foundation for longevity. And then we want to build strength on top of it, because after the age of 35, we lose muscle. So naturally we lose a pound, about on average, the average person after 35 loses a pound of muscle per year.
Wow.
So if we aren't doing something to build muscle, which means weight under a load, that isn't just like doing air squats, right? This is like doing squats, and it doesn't have to be crazy heavy. You don't need to be in the weight room like trying to max out on squats, but you do need to be doing 5 to 10 moves times 3 or 4 that put you under a load, whether that's dumbbells, dumbbell squats, dumbbell deadlift, goblet squats with like a kettlebell, stuff like that, where you're putting it under a load and making yourself go through a full range of motion. And that's building a strength through a full range of motion. So we're working on mobility for range of motion, and then we're working on strength to have strength through that range of motion, right? So we don't just have mobility, we also have strength through that range of motion as well. And so that's really why we're putting those two, and those two kind of have to go hand in hand. And so doing really functional movements with strength. So I like to, kind of talk about a couple of like what we call umbrella moves. We want to push, we want to pull, we want to squat, we want to hinge, and we want to lunge. So one-legged type of movement. So especially for runners. So push-ups, pull-ups, for example, is push-pull, right? Another would be, squats would be stuff like deadlifts and squats and things like that. And these can be one-leg or two-leg movements, right? They can be together or they can be one-legged. You could do a one-legged squat or you could do a one-legged deadlift, right, as well. And when you get strength, once you get that base strength, I like to start athletes with like just two-leg movements, not one-legged, except maybe like a lunge or an ATG split squat or a Bulgarian split squat, or something like that. But I like to like get them the base moves first before they move to like one-legged stuff all the time. And then as they get strength and mobility and confidence and know how to do the moves, properly, and thinking about engagement. So to give you a quick tip on engagement, and this is something you will not see very often if you go to any gym. And that is what I call the 3-2-1 protocol of movement. So 3-second count lowering the weight, 2-second count holding the weight at the bottom of the movement, and then a 1-second exploding the weight up. So for example, if we're doing a deadlift, it would be 3 seconds on the squatting down, 2-second count holding at the bottom of the movement, and then 1 second exploding up and squeezing glutes and resetting. So that's an example of a 3-2-1 protocol. And I like to do that. That's why I do dumbbell work mainly. I don't even do squat rack or any of like kind of heavier deadlifts. I do them with dumbbells and I go up in weight. After I, like at least once a week, I do some kind of powerlifting sets where you'd start like a first set of like 12 and then do like 6 and 4 with heavier weight in the last 2 sets. And that way you're really building strength, but not putting on any kind of bulk. And we're running enough, most runners are running enough that we're not going to put on we're not going to put on bulk, right? We're going to, unless you're just throwing weight around every day in the weight room, but you're not really going to put on bulk. We're just trying to maintain our muscle mass as we age. So if we're talking after the age of 35 and especially after the age of 40, we're really talking about trying to maintain muscle mass and not lose it, right? So, I've weighed this pretty much the same for a lot of years because I still have the same amount of muscle that I did, 15 years ago, and I'm in my 50s. So that's because I work on it. And I've had to I used to do 2 days a week in the weight room, and now I have to do 3 to keep that muscle mass. Because I've noticed in my 50s that muscle mass is going away. It goes away faster, right? So if I miss a couple weeks, I'm feeling a lot softer quicker. Maybe it's in my head, but I don't think it is. It's definitely in the literature. So that's kind of that's kind of strength and mobility together, and just kind of a general overview. The next piece of the puzzle that I think probably should be number 1 on the list, and that's nutrition. So real food. There's been multiple studies come out in the last several years on high protein intake in athletes, and it's tied to recovery. No major negative outcomes from going pretty high on protein intake per day. We recommend to our athletes 1.1 to 1.3 grams of protein per pound of body weight. That's a lot. I weigh 140 pounds. That's about 150 to 180 grams of protein a day for me, to give you an idea. Um, and we say 1 gram per pound as a minimum dose per day when you are working out. So the days you do, run and strength and other things, whenever we have a workout day, we want to make sure we're hitting over 1 gram per pound of body weight. Obviously I'm fit into kind of what Mike McKnight talked about last week, and that is kind of a high fat, low carb approach. I've been doing it now about 8 years. Before that, for about 12 or 13 years, I did a Whole Foods organic. And before that, I was 7 years as a vegetarian in my 20s. I did not thrive as a vegetarian. Neither did my wife. We were having some health issues. We were having trouble getting pregnant. We started eating meat again, started drinking raw milk, started doing organic, and we were able to get pregnant and have kids. And now we have 3 kids. So, but one of the things that I think happened in that transition that I realized, one, we cut out a lot of processed food, but we were still doing grains. We were still doing a little bit of sugar, like organic sugar, and stuff like that. But we were doing kind of unprocessed foods in our kind of everyday diet. At least like what I call an 80-20 rule, 80% of the time. And I do want to get to that too. I'll get to that in training, 80-20 in training, but 80-20 in nutrition as well. And what we call 90-10 or 80-20. That means trying to stick to the plan 80 to 90% of the time, which is kind of where I hit most of the time. That leaves about 2 to 4 meals a week to not sweat it so much. That keeps you sane. That's easy to go to dinner. It's easy to eat out, stuff like that. Now, I do avoid certain foods personally. I'm a little more strict than the average person, but that's served me well, I feel. So when we're talking about foods, even when we talk about protein, we kind of coach athletes to prioritize protein in every meal. So, 3 to 4 servings of protein per day. Don't do a lot of snacking in between meals. Snacking's not that great for you. And to give you an idea why, there's something called, this research that came out of Colorado State. It's called MMC, migrating motor complex. So anybody will know what I'm talking about as soon as I kind of describe this. Whenever you haven't eaten for a bit, we get this kind of like growly stomach, right? We've always been told our whole life that that's hunger pangs. It's not. That is a lie. It's actually something called migrating motor complex. And whenever we have not put any food into digestion for about 2 to 3 hours in most foods, depending on what you ate, the complexity of the food matters, right? And how fast it digests. But in a 2 to 4 hour window of not putting any more food into digestion, the body goes into this thing where that growly stomach is actually muscle contractions in the GI tract trying to cleanse the GI tract. So it's trying to move undigested food and some waste product out of your GI tract, out of your intestinal tract, and move it through the GI tract. But if you just throw a peanut back into the mix, a little bit of food, a little snack, a couple of nuts, it doesn't matter, like a little tiny snack, immediately the body goes back to digestion. It says all hands on deck, digestion. And it shuts down migrating motor complex and that cleansing mechanism of those contractions. So we want to let that happen every once in a while. I kind of say, I like to let it happen at least once a day. Mm-hmm. But what we tell athletes is don't eat inside of 3 hours, but don't go more than 5 hours without eating. So that's always going to put you in a little bit of that migrating motor complex for at least an hour before every meal, without all that snacking. And then when you eat a meal, eat and let it burn. So, and so that's way better for your GI tract, your colon. It's going to help that cleansing mechanism work. And then when you're prioritizing protein, not all protein is created equal. One of the things that I think does a disservice to people in the mainstream is they don't talk about bioavailability. And bioavailability of foods is a really important side subject of food. And so, for example, something like beans and rice, for example, from my vegetarian days, that would have been a whole amino acid profile from a vegetarian source, right? That food is only going to be less than 50% bioavailable, that beans and rice. Whereas, say, an 8-ounce steak is going to be over 90% bioavailable. So animal products are going to be way more bioavailable. Now, I'm not talking about processed meats and stuff like that, right? I'm talking about real food. I'm talking about, fish and chicken and beef and elk and venison and, so real food, fish, fowl, herbivore.
Mhm.
Right. We are hunter gatherers, like from a genetic standpoint, right? Our genetic code is hunter gatherer. And so we want to try to mirror personally. This is what Mike McKnight and I try to do. We try to mirror our hunter gatherer genetics in a modern world, right? We can get mangoes in January and when they aren't ripened in season, right? Because it's always everything's ripened in season at the grocery store every day.
Mhm.
And we no longer eat seasonally. We never go into like this kind of more high fat, low carb approach for part of the year. And then we would eat a lot of carbs for 2 or 3 months in most latitudes. Um, but what we try to do is mimic that on like a micro level instead of a macro level of a seasonal eating pattern. We'd be kind of some days we'd have more carbs around our effort and volume and strategically time fruit and potatoes. I personally stay away from grains and sugar, in my lifestyle diet 80% of the time. So I'm avoiding flour-based products, um, pastas, rice. I'll occasionally eat rice. I'll occasionally eat sushi. I like white rice. The other thing you want to know about is like uh, in general food groups, there's something called phytic acid or what we call anti-nutrients in a lot of vegetables and grains. So there's things like lectins, oxalates, phytic acid, and grains have some of that stuff as well that will block things like zinc and iron absorption in your gut. So, for example, brown rice versus white rice is to give you an example of what the difference is. Brown rice is hold, white rice is dehulled, and when the most of the phytic acid is in the hull of the rice. So when they dehull it, the white rice actually has a higher glycemic index because it's a little more starchy, but it will have less phytic acid in it, which means it won't block iron and zinc absorption as much. Now, you can do other things like prep that food by soaking it overnight to break some of the phytic acid down. Just cover it with water and a couple tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, cover it up on your counter and let it sit overnight and then cook it the next day. Another thing we can do for like that helps with GI stuff, things like potatoes and rice, we can take those and cook them for a meal and then let them cool, and some of the glucose molecules will convert to resistant starch overnight. So just the cooling process of cooling down a potato, cooling down rice, and then you can reheat it after that. But once it's gone through the cooling process, some of the glucose molecules convert to resistant starch.
Hmm.
Then that feeds good gut bacteria. So that's another thing. If you've ever had a lot of antibiotics, you've ever had a lot of like that kind of stuff where it wrecks your gut, you can do things like, live sauerkraut and uh, uh, fermented, dairy
Mhm.
and stuff like that, and as well as like cooled rice, cooled potatoes, and then reheat them or just eat them cold, whichever you prefer. Just have to go through the cooling process. So that kind of covers resistant starch. We covered phytic acid. Another thing, here's another one for you all out there that like to put raw stuff in your smoothies or in your salad. Raw spinach, for example, horrible for you when it's raw. It is not healthy. It is really high in oxalates, which basically create similar to what we compound. It has a compound in it called oxalates that are like a crystallized um, uh, product in it that basically creates similar things to like kidney stones. So oxalate's not great for you. We can't break them down. You can saute spinach and it will like on lower heat, and that can help break down some of the oxalates in it. But if you're throwing a raw spinach in your smoothie, you're getting a ton of oxalates and it's not super good for you. So kale's the same way. So knowing that those things like soy protein, for example, pea protein, Not very bioavailable, not very high in lysine, especially you women out there you really, if you're a runner, you need lysine. And pea protein sucks from a lysine perspective, but like things like whey protein is better.
Hmm.
And obviously animal products like eggs and fish and fowl and herbivore, like we talked about earlier. What else? Oxalates, lectins. Okay, so soy products. I personally am allergic to soy. So I figured this out as an adult. I avoid it like the plague. I ask at restaurants. I read labels, and because it's GI stress that I have, and I just thought I had a weird gut until I figured it out as an adult, because I figured out through an elimination diet with one of my oldest son who also has a soy allergy, and we figured out he was allergic. And then I started looking at labels too. I'm like, I kind of have similar symptoms, and started kind of checking it out and realized that I was allergic as well. But soy's in a lot of stuff. It's hidden all over the place. And one of the things that's really bad about soy is it's really high in something called lectins, which is a protein that is a molecular mimicker. It isn't actually a protein we can break down, but it looks like a protein we can break down. So when it's in our gut, think of proteins as a key, and your intestinal wall as like a keyholes, and those proteins unlock that blood barrier and let those proteins into your bloodstream so they can go be put on, those amino acids can come in from that steak or those eggs and go down and like be dropped off for repair. Okay. And lectins are one of those molecular mimickers that unlocks that blood barrier, but gets in there, but it causes inflammation, and we can't utilize it as a protein. So it's not a great protein. So be aware of those kind of things like anti-nutrients that we're talking about. I like my athletes to be really educated on this process when they're going to change their diet. I don't like to say, hey, I'm doing this because Mike McKnight told me to, or Jeff Browning told me to. I want them to know why they're doing it, where we came from as hunter-gatherers, where we are genetically, how we're wired, and understand that. And then if you really care about, the sustainability of animals, right? Then I would recommend looking at things like the book Sacred Cow, and another one called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Tolschlitz. Both of those books are really good. There's a documentary out. I think it's free on YouTube now under Sacred Cow. And you could probably find that online. But it's talking about grass-fed herbivores mainly being very good for the planet. If you think about, we've lost 70% of our natural grasslands in the world to monoculture. I grew up on a commercial farm in Missouri in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And that it's just not good. One plant on millions of acres, there's no biodiversity. And we are getting rid of a grasslands that there's supposed to be giant herds on. And that's what we originally did. We followed the herds. And that's what we're kind of wired to consume. And even though the mainstream narrative tells us otherwise, it goes against our nature. And so understanding if you dig deeply, you'll realize that we should be converting all these corn, soybeans, and wheat fields back to their original grasslands, right? And understanding that's what's truly sustainable for long-term for the planet. And one of the things we were talking about offline here before Eric and I were chatting about, I drove down to Mesa, Arizona today from Flagstaff. I work with a regional rancher that does a grass-fed ranch operation of cattle, and I get a half of beef from them about every 6 months. And I have to drive down to get it from the butcher, and in frozen packages. I bring coolers in the back of my truck. I drive down there. I pay the rancher directly for for that half cow, and then I pay the butcher directly for their processing. And I'm paying retail prices straight to the ranch. There's no middleman. I get it direct from the ranch. I know the quality, and then that goes in my deep freeze in my garage, and that will feed us for the next 3 or 4 months, a family of 5, and we'll have a ton of beef. and then we'll infill with fish and chicken and other stuff. But the point is there's ways to do this in a more inexpensive way and also support a grass-fed operation that's good for the planet. So be educated on this. And I don't like people to be pawns, I guess, is what I'm saying. And then
Jeff, real quick before we change subjects, can you touch on seed oils and just
yes,
how
good. Thank you, Eric. So one of the other things I avoid is seed oils. So seed oils would be anything like soybeans, safflower, sunflower, canola oil. Those are some of the main ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with these oils, okay, that they are a polyunsaturated fat. So there's three fats. There's monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and saturated fat. Saturated fat, things like coconut oil, butter, ghee, lard, tallow. Those are the most complex molecular chain of the fats. And those are the most stable under heat, light, and air. Okay, that's where it's going to oxidize. Okay, monounsaturated fats are things like olive oil and avocado oil. Okay, those are going to be not quite as stable as saturated fats under heat, light, and air. That's one of the reasons that olive oil comes in a dark bottle, but they're more stable. So they do go good under low heat, not high heat. So saturated fat does well under high cooking conditions, baking, frying, cooking in a skillet. And then olive oil and avocado oil are a little better used in like sauteing or in ways that way, okay? Or slightly rubbing something with it before you cook it on a grill, for example. Mm-hmm. And then we get into this seed oil category, or what we call PUFAs, P-U-F-A, polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are the most unstable of the molecular chains. So they oxidize under heat, light, and air, okay? So think about it this way. When we go to extract those seed oils, it's a very high heat process. So immediately they're oxidized. Then they're also exposed to air and light. And so they're fully oxidized by the time they're just extracted. Then they're put in a bottle, most of the time a clear bottle, if you look at the store. They're sitting in a clear bottle. Now they're being oxidized by the light further. So they're fully oxidized and rancid by the time you consume them. Your body does not, super high in omega-6s. They are not good for you. There's been over 70 newer studies that have come out in the last 15 or 20 years that have debunked this diet heart hypothesis. And that is that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. So I would definitely highly recommend, if you're still under that dogma umbrella of saturated fat and cholesterol causing heart disease. That's why I mentioned the book, Big Fat Surprise. Great book. She spent 10 years researching and writing that book, going back to over 1,000 original studies, not just reading the abstract, but reading all the studies. It's a great book to tell you how we got our food pyramid, who the people were involved, and all the corruption behind it, and the special interest behind it, especially in the farming, big ag industry and sugar industry. Lots of lobbying and lots of paid for research by special interest with an outcome already in mind, not true science. Mm-hmm. So, true science is trying to poke holes in your own theory, and not just trying to find an outcome, a predetermined outcome. And so that should kind of covers. I avoid all seed oils. Now you can't avoid them when you eat out. Like when you go, 99% of restaurants are going to cook in some kind of a seed oil. Everything they cook, whether it's on the skillet, whether it's in a fryer, all fast food, they're all going to be seed oils. You'll occasionally find this, diamond in the rough that maybe still makes their French fries and burgers in like beef tallow or something, but it's very rare. There is a place in Moab, and I eat there every time I go. But I would say, be aware of those things, educate yourself. If you're not sure about it, continue to research. I just recommend people, really start to learn the stuff for themselves if they're thinking about making a change. Let's see. That kind of covers kind of our nutritional piece of this, I'm going to move on to injury prevention imbalances. We kind of covered that already. I mean, I think the big one, the other thing we could add to that is what I call the 80-20 rule of training. And that is 80% of your volume or more per week should be under your aerobic ceiling. Meaning, if people are familiar with Phil Maffetone, MAF heart rate is kind of a general one to try. You can also get a regular lactate test. That would be zone 2 heart rate is the highest. So that your top of your zone 2 heart rate, you wouldn't go over that 80% of the time. So we want to stay aerobic 80% of the time. The other 15 to 20% of the time is left over for faster work, what we call polarized training, which would be zone 4, zone 5 heart rate, or some zone 3 heart rate, which is something we race in a lot in the marathon. 50Ks, stuff like that. We would race more in that what we call steady state, or kind of that zone 3 heart rate, kind of the metabolic gray zone that a lot of runners will run like 50% of their volume in. That slightly comfortably hard pace that you could maintain for a couple hours is not a great place to be. So if you're doing that, quit doing it, run slower, even if you got to take hike breaks on the hills at first, but slowly you'll be able to run the hills too.
Yeah.
If you kind of embrace. Yeah, go ahead.
And we talk a lot about running on perceived effort and staying the conversation pace for your zone 2 training. Yes. And then just how to analyze what perceived effort you're in by being able to, where you carrying a conversation, you can get a word out here and there and not being able to talk at all.
Yeah. The talk test is a great way. I love rate of perceived exertion. I like RPE. That's how we coach our athletes, is RPE. We will use heart rate a little bit with specific athletes that they've been tested, but more on their either their easy days so they don't go too hard, or more on their hard days so they kind of know what target heart rate to go after.
Yeah.
Like what zone. So RPE is a really great way to do that. So being in that easier, talk test for 80+% of your volume. From a longevity perspective, that's, definitely, you don't get much more improvement going over 20%. There really isn't in the literature. It just shows that you have higher risk of injury, higher risk of burnout. And part of that is because we tip that pH in our system to more acidic when we go over that aerobic ceiling. And so you're in the state of acidosis in the metabolic system, that your body's trying to get rid of the stress. And this ups our stress hormones and all kinds of stuff, and we don't recover very well. And then I think the last piece of this that we want to kind of bring up is periodized cross-training. Cross-training during peak training. So adding extra volume in is another way to use it. So stuff like cycling, hiking, swimming, elliptical, things like that. So I personally, coming from a cycling background, my first cross training, or another one would be Nordic skiing, snowshoeing, stuff like that. I personally ski a little bit. I do some backcountry skiing. I do some Nordic skiing. And I also ride my bike quite a bit still. And I even mix my bike in bigger volume block training in the summer, especially when the weather's nice. I'll ride to trailheads, stash my bike in the woods, lock it to a tree, go for a run, come back, grab my bike, commute home instead of driving to the trailhead. I'll ride to the trailhead, so anywhere from 10 or 15 minutes to a trailhead commute up to 30, 45 minutes to a commute. So things like that, mixing those in, it's a great way to mix in when you're having a little niggle and you're like, oh, I'm sore after, get on the bike, right? Or go for a hike. Don't go pound. And the other that I think is a very important one, the 2-day rule. We'll call it a 2-day rule. A 2-day rule is, if you have something that is this niggle I got going on, go cross-train for 2 days on something that does not aggravate it. So if cycling doesn't aggravate it, or elliptical doesn't aggravate it, go do that instead of running in place of your run for 2 days. Day 3, go test it. Meaning, don't go get committed to a route somewhere. right? A loop or something, go run around the block a couple times or get on a treadmill and like test it out. Is it still there? Okay. If it's a 1 or 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, you could probably run on it. But if it's over that or if it's increasing, then you need to haul that workout and walk home and go back to the 2-day rule back in effect. Go cross train for 2 days that does not aggravate it. Test it again on day 3 and keep doing that until it's better. And the other thing I would do in tandem with that is start researching the issue you're having and trying to figure out what that is. Now, one of the things we do in our coaching business, because we do have a PT that's a coach, we do like try to help you be the first line of defense against an injury. So if something's kind of coming up, we're going to go, okay, we're going to work up and down the chain, and we're going to work on mobility, and we're going to kind of target it with some foam rolling and stuff like that. We have a lot of foam rolling videos that we give our athletes that target specific issues, whether it's runner's knee, IT band syndrome, stuff like that. Let's see. I think that kind of covers a lot. Is there anything I missed? Any questions, I guess?
Yeah. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and post them now before we jump off. But one thing I noticed when you were talking about cross training is that it sounded like it was all low impact. Do you encourage that more than any high impact cross training?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to do high impact cross training, I would say that would be stuff in the gym. Whether that's, I do plyometrics as well. That's one thing I did not mention in the strength stuff. I do some form of plyometrics regularly as well. So whether that's squat, as simple as like a squat jump, or it might be weighted with dumbbells, like what we call explosive, like an explosive squat jump with like, push press thruster is what it's called, where you'd have light dumbbells and you jump over your head and then come back down and into a squat position and jump up again, sets of 6 with 10 seconds rest between, and do a bunch of sets. Okay. Explosive walking lunges is another one that we use. Some people, I have a couple athletes that do box jumps, step up, step downs. But I do think one of the things that is the benefit of running is that we are getting bone density benefit from running, right? From that weight bearing load, and the same with strength training, it gets it as well. But I do think one thing we lose as we age is our bounce. So I think keeping some kind of plyometric in the mix, personally for me, I like to have that in the mix because I feel better. I can handle, and I love technical trail running and mountain trail running. So a lot of like drop offs and big stair steps and very rocky technical terrain, where you might have a 3-foot drop every once in a while, and you have to do a double foot landing to make that, be like jumping off a box. And so I liked having that motion and that load, my body adapted to that. So it isn't stressed when I do that. Yeah. I can do it with confidence. I do it because I practice it. I practice it while I'm trail running as well, and making sure that, and that's one of the reasons personally I race so much, because that keeps me sharp. This race I did over the weekend was very technical. It's very technical, rocky terrain. At least all the stuff up that has any vert in it, all the stuff around the base is in the desert and looks nice and buff. If you look at my Instagram, you'll see some buff trail running because it's coming in and out of aid station at the base. But all the technical stuff up top, we don't have video of. I wish I did, because it's crazy technical, and you're constantly dancing the whole time, dropping off of drop-offs and all kinds of stuff. So, but I like to have that practice and adaptation.
Before we jump off, I'd like to ask all the guests before we leave, what does my endurance life mean to you in a personal context?
Well, for me, I mean, that is my life. That is endurance life. Every day revolves around some kind of endurance. And especially in the early days when I had 3 kids, younger kids, they're older, they're a little older now, 21, 18, and 12. But that was part of the endurance piece as well, is just taking care of kids and trying to train. And but my endurance life is coaching, it's running still and competing. I'm still very motivated to train hard, and put the time in and do the hard work that it requires to be competitive. I still love it. I'm still very, very driven. So that's, I guess, what it means to me.
Yeah. Yeah. What inspires you to keep going?
Oh man, I don't know. I've got this internal fire that doesn't shut off. Um, I really love the active training. So I love the puzzle of ultras. I love the long distance stuff like hundreds and 200s. I really like that kind of trying to figure all those pieces out together, right? Whether it's like nutrition, hydration, electrolyte balance, pace, gear, weather conditions, heat adaptation,
Mhm.
all the kind of pieces that come together to culminate a good performance. Um, but I also love the act of just every day going. I've always lived, Bend, Oregon, Logan, Utah, Bozeman, Montana, and Flagstaff since I've been into ultra running. And so I've always lived in a mountain town. I've always lived close to trail access. I've always been able to run a trail from my house, meaning I've been able to run at least, out of my neighborhood and find dirt.
Mhm.
And so I love running in the woods. I love running in nature. And I really I just love, wild spaces. And so I'm very motivated. It's my happy place, man. It's where it's a stress reliever. It's where I do my entrepreneurial thinking. It's where I think about being a good parent or being a good husband or the things I'm doing wrong as a parent or a husband, and analyzing that stuff and trying to be better. And I think it's a really, or as a coach even, or what I need to hey, what call do I have this afternoon? Oh yeah, that athlete. I need to think about this with that
Mhm.
athlete, right? So that's my time out there, and I love that time, and I look forward to it every day. So I just look at it as part of going to the office,
Yeah.
um, and I'm not I don't know. I just still have that drive, and it doesn't go away for me.